Sarah Martinez never imagined that her decision to join the Army would lead her to the most dangerous place on earth. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she had always been the quiet one, the girl who helped her neighbors, volunteered at the local hospital, and dreamed of becoming a nurse. When the Army recruiter visited her high school, Sarah saw an opportunity to serve her country while gaining the medical training she desperately wanted. The recruiter painted a picture of adventure and purpose. Sarah would become a combat medic, they said, helping wounded soldiers and making a real difference. What they didn't mention was how others would see her role. To many of the seasoned infantry soldiers, medics were just support personnel. Important, yes, but not real fighters. They were there to patch people up, not to engage the enemy. Sarah completed her basic training with flying colors. Her instructors noticed her calm demeanor under pressure and her natural ability to think quickly in crisis situations. She learned how to treat gunshot wounds, perform emergency surgery in field conditions, and carry a wounded soldier twice her weight across rough terrain. But despite her impressive skills, she still felt the weight of others' expectations, or lack thereof. When Sarah received her deployment orders to Afghanistan, her family gathered around the dinner table for what might be their last meal together. For months, her father, a Vietnam veteran, looked at her with pride but also worry. Her mother cried quietly, trying to hide her fears. Her younger brother asked if she would be safe, and Sarah promised she would be careful. Deep down, she knew that in a war zone, no one could make such promises. The flight to Kandahar airfield was long and uncomfortable. Sarah sat among dozens of other soldiers, each lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them. Some slept, others wrote letters home, and a few played cards to pass the time. Sarah spent the journey reviewing her medical training manuals, knowing that soon she might need to use every technique she had learned to save lives. Upon arrival at the forward operating base, Sarah was assigned to Alpha Company, a unit of infantry, soldiers who had been deployed for several months already. They were tired, battle-hardened, and skeptical of newcomers. The company commander, Captain Johnson, welcomed her briefly and assigned her to a small medical station within the base. Perimeter. Her job was to provide immediate medical care to wounded soldiers before they could be evacuated to larger hospitals. The other soldiers in Alpha Company were polite but distant. They called her Doc, which was standard for all medics, but Sarah could sense their underlying attitude. To them, she was support staff, necessary but not really part of the team that did the real fighting. They would nod and say hello, but conversations rarely went beyond pleasantries. Sarah tried not to let it bother her, focusing instead on setting up her medical equipment and preparing for whatever challenges lay ahead. The base itself was a collection of temporary buildings, sandbags, and concrete barriers surrounded by high walls and razor wire. Guard towers overlooked the surrounding desert, where the enemy could be hiding behind any hill or building. The constant sound of helicopters, trucks, and generators created a background noise that never stopped. Sarah's medical station was a converted shipping container with basic surgical equipment, medications, and supplies that she hoped would be enough when the time came. During her first week, Sarah treated minor injuries, cuts, burns, twisted ankles, and the occasional bout of food poisoning. These routine cases allowed her to get familiar with her equipment and build some rapport with the soldiers. However, she noticed that when it came to serious discussions about upcoming missions or tactical decisions, she was rarely included. The message was clear. She was there to fix people after the fighting was done, not to be part of the actual combat operations. Sarah spent her evenings writing letters home and studying advanced trauma care procedures. She knew that her real test would come soon enough. Intelligence reports suggested that enemy activity in the area was increasing, and the company was preparing for more aggressive patrols and operations. Sarah checked and rechecked her supplies, organized her equipment for quick access, and mentally rehearsed the procedures she might need to perform under fire. As she lay in her bunk at night, listening to the distant sounds of the war zone, Sarah wondered if she would prove herself when the moment came. She had trained for combat situations, but training was different from reality. Would she be able to stay calm when bullets were flying? Would she be brave enough to run toward danger to help wounded soldiers? These questions kept her awake, staring at the ceiling of her small quarters, knowing that soon she would have all the answers she never wanted to find. The morning alarm shattered Sarah's restless sleep at 500 hours. Today was different. She could feel it in the air. The usual chatter among the soldiers was replaced by focused, quiet conversations. Alpha Company had received orders for a major operation in the Helmand Valley, a region known for heavy Taliban presence and fierce fighting. This wasn't going to be another routine patrol. Captain Johnson called a briefing for all personnel at 0600. Sarah grabbed her coffee and notebook, joining the circle of soldiers who would be participating in the mission. The captain spread a detailed map on the table, pointing to various locations with his finger. Their objective was to clear a series of compounds suspected of harboring insurgent fighters and weapons caches. Intelligence suggested the area was heavily fortified and that resistance would be significant. "Martinez," Captain Johnson said, looking directly at Sarah, "you'll be staying here at the base. We'll have a field medic with each squad, and the evacuation helicopters are on standby." Sarah felt a familiar sting of disappointment. Once again she was being left behind while the real action happened elsewhere. The other soldiers nodded approvingly, as if this was the obvious and sensible decision. "Sir, with respect," Sarah spoke up, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I've trained for forward operations. If casualties are expected to be high, wouldn't it be better to have additional medical support closer to the action?" Several soldiers exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes at what they saw as an inexperienced medic trying to play soldier. Captain Johnson considered her words for a moment. "Doc, your job is to keep our wounded stable until they can reach proper medical facilities. That's best done from a secure location." The discussion was over, and Sarah knew better than to press the issue further. She would remain at the base, waiting for wounded soldiers to be brought to her. The convoy departed at dawn, leaving behind a skeleton crew to maintain base security. Sarah watched from the medical station as the heavily armed vehicles disappeared into the desert landscape. The radio crackled with periodic updates as the units moved toward their objectives. Everything seemed routine for the first few hours, standard movement reports and position confirmations. Then around 1100 hours the radio traffic changed. Voices became more urgent, and Sarah heard the words every medic dreads. "Contact, contact. We're taking heavy fire." The peaceful morning was shattered by reports of intense fighting erupting from multiple locations. The enemy had been waiting, and Alpha Company had walked into a well-prepared ambush. The first casualties arrived within an hour. A helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust, and Sarah ran toward it as soldiers carried their wounded comrades from the aircraft. The first soldier had taken shrapnel to his leg, the second was unconscious with a head injury, and the third was clutching his abdomen where dark blood seeped through his uniform. Sarah's training took over immediately. She triaged the wounded, prioritizing treatment based on the severity of injuries. The soldier with the abdominal wound needed immediate surgery to stop internal bleeding. Sarah worked quickly but carefully, her hands steady as she opened his vest and began the delicate procedure. Around her, other medical personnel helped with the less critical injuries, but Sarah found herself handling the most serious cases. As she worked, the radio continued to broadcast updates from the battlefield. More units were pinned down, ammunition was running low, and additional casualties were mounting. The original plan had fallen apart, and Alpha Company found itself fighting for survival against a determined and well-equipped enemy force. Another helicopter arrived, this one carrying 4 more wounded soldiers. One had lost significant blood from a severe arm injury, another was barely conscious from a concussion, and 2 others had various degrees of shrapnel wounds. Sarah realized that her small medical station was quickly becoming overwhelmed. She had trained for mass casualty situations, but the reality was far more chaotic than any simulation. Working alongside the other medical staff, Sarah established an efficient system for treating the incoming wounded. She assigned tasks, prioritized treatments, and maintained constant communication with the evacuation helicopters. Her earlier frustration about being left behind had completely evaporated. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she had trained to do. By afternoon, Sarah had treated 17 wounded soldiers, performing 3 emergency surgeries and countless wound treatments. Her uniform was covered in blood, her hands were cramped from hours of delicate work, but she never stopped moving. Each helicopter that landed brought new challenges and new opportunities to save lives. The radio updates from the field painted a grim picture. Alpha Company was surrounded, taking casualties faster than they could be evacuated. Several soldiers were critically wounded, but couldn't be reached by rescue helicopters due to heavy enemy fire. For the first time since the fighting began, Sarah heard something in the radio chatter that chilled her. Desperation. As the sun began to set over the base, Sarah looked at the rows of wounded soldiers she had treated. Some were stable and would recover fully. Others faced long rehabilitation, and a few had injuries that would change their lives forever. But they were alive, and that was what mattered. However, she knew that out in the valley, her fellow soldiers were still fighting for their lives, and the hardest part of this battle was yet to come. The situation deteriorated rapidly as night fell over the Helmand Valley. Radio communications from Alpha Company became increasingly desperate, with reports of soldiers trapped in a compound surrounded by enemy forces. The Taliban fighters had used the cover of darkness to move closer, cutting off evacuation routes and making helicopter rescues impossible. Sarah listened to the radio traffic with growing concern. Sergeant Williams, one of the squad leaders, reported that they had 6 critically wounded soldiers who wouldn't survive until morning without immediate medical attention. The field medics were doing their best, but they lacked the equipment and expertise needed for complex trauma surgery. Time was running out. "We need a surgeon up here now." Sergeant Williams's voice crackled through the radio. "Peterson's got internal bleeding we can't stop, and Rodriguez hasn't been conscious for 2 hours. If we don't get help soon, we're going to lose them." Captain Johnson's voice came through the radio from the command post where he was coordinating with higher command for reinforcements. "Negative, Williams. The LZ is too hot. No helicopter can get through that fire. You'll have to hold position until we can establish a corridor." Sarah had been listening to these exchanges for hours, growing more frustrated with each report. She knew she had the skills to help those wounded soldiers, but she was stuck at the base while they slowly died in the field. The weight of her perceived limitations pressed down on her. She was just support, just a medic who stayed in the safe zones while the real soldiers did the fighting and dying. At 21:30 hours, the radio brought news that changed everything. "Base, this is Williams. We just lost Peterson. He bled out about 5 minutes ago. Rodriguez is next if we don't get help soon." Sarah felt a punch to her stomach. Peterson was 22 years old from Ohio with a girlfriend back home who sent him cookies every month. She had treated him for a minor infection just a week earlier. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. She walked to the command post where the remaining officers were huddled around radios and maps, trying to coordinate a rescue mission. "Sir," she said to the acting commander, "I volunteer to go in with the next supply drop." Lieutenant Morrison, who had taken over tactical coordination, looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Doc, that's not happening. It's a one-way trip right now. The enemy has the compound surrounded and we can't guarantee extraction." "Those soldiers are dying," Sarah replied firmly. "I have the training to save them, but only if I can get to them. A supply drop by parachute won't help if there's no one there who can perform surgery." The room fell silent except for the static of radio communications. Other soldiers stared at Sarah, many seeing her in a new light for the first time. This wasn't the quiet support person they had dismissed. This was someone willing to jump into hell to save their friends. After several minutes of heated discussion, Lieutenant Morrison made the call. A single helicopter would attempt a dangerous night insertion, dropping Sarah and additional medical supplies as close to the trapped soldiers as possible. The pilot would have one chance to get in and out before enemy fire made the area completely impassable. Sarah spent the next hour preparing for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. She packed her medical bag with trauma surgery equipment, blood plasma, and every medication she might need. Her hands were steady as she organized her supplies, but her mind raced with thoughts of home, family, and the soldiers counting on her skills. The helicopter crew was grim, but professional as they prepared for takeoff. The pilot, Chief Warrant Officer Stevens, had been flying in combat zones for over a decade. "Doc," he said as Sarah climbed into the aircraft. "Once I drop you off, I can't promise when we'll be able to get you out. You sure about this?" Sarah nodded, adjusting her body armor and checking her medical bag one final time. "Those soldiers would do the same for me," she replied, though her voice was nearly drowned out by the rotor noise. The flight to the compound took 25 minutes, flying low through the darkness to avoid enemy radar and anti-aircraft fire. Sarah could see tracer rounds and explosions lighting up the landscape below. The fighting was more intense than she had imagined, with muzzle flashes coming from multiple directions around the surrounded compound. As they approached the landing zone, the helicopter came under immediate fire. Bullets pinged off the aircraft's armor, and Chief Stevens had to perform evasive maneuvers to avoid being shot down. "LZ is too hot," he shouted over the intercom. "I'm going to have to drop you about 200 meters out." Sarah grabbed her medical bag and prepared to jump as the helicopter hovered just above the ground. Through the open door, she could see the compound where her fellow soldiers were fighting for their lives. Enemy muzzle flashes lit up the darkness all around the building, and she realized she would have to cross 200 meters of open ground under fire to reach the wounded. As her feet hit the ground and the helicopter disappeared into the night sky, Sarah Martinez was completely alone in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The quiet support person was about to prove that heroes come in all forms, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to save lives. Sarah hit the rocky ground hard, her medical bag bouncing beside her as bullets whistled overhead. The helicopter's rotor wash had barely settled when enemy fighters began directing their fire toward her position. She rolled behind a small stone wall, her heart pounding as reality set in. She was alone, surrounded by hostile forces, with 200 meters of open ground between her and the soldiers who desperately needed her help. The compound ahead looked like a fortress under siege. Muzzle flashes erupted from the windows where Alpha Company was making their stand, while enemy fire came from at least 3 directions. Explosions from rocket-propelled grenades shook the ground, sending debris flying through the air. Sarah had trained for combat situations, but nothing had prepared her for the overwhelming noise, chaos, and terror of a real firefight. She keyed, her radio trying to establish contact with Sergeant Williams inside the compound. "Williams, this is Martinez. I'm about 200 meters south of your position. What's the best route to get to you?" Williams's voice came back immediately, strained, but relieved. "Doc, you're crazy for coming out here, but thank God you did. Rodriguez just went into cardiac arrest. We got him back, but barely. The south wall has the least enemy fire, but you'll still be exposed for about 50 meters. Sarah studied the terrain between her position and the compound. The landscape was mostly flat desert with scattered rocks and a few small ditches that might provide minimal cover. She would have to move fast and hope that darkness would help conceal her movement. Taking a deep breath, she secured her medical bag across her chest and prepared to make the most dangerous sprint of her life. The first 100 meters went better than expected. Sarah moved from cover to cover, using every shadow and depression in the ground to avoid detection. Her training in battlefield movement served her well as she crawled, ran, and dove her way across the hostile terrain. Enemy tracers flew overhead, but most of their fire was directed at the compound where the main battle was raging. Halfway to the compound, Sarah's luck ran out. An enemy fighter spotted her movement and began shooting in her direction. Bullets sparked off the rocks around her as she dove into a shallow ditch. She was pinned down, unable to move forward or backward without exposing herself to deadly fire. The wounded soldiers were so close she could hear their voices, but she might as well have been on the other side of the world. That's when Sergeant Williams made a decision that showed why he was respected by every soldier in Alpha Company. "Covering fire now," he shouted, and suddenly every weapon in the compound opened up on the enemy positions. The intensity of fire from the surrounded soldiers was so fierce that it forced the enemy fighters to take cover, giving Sarah the opening she needed. She sprinted the final 50 meters in what felt like slow motion. Every step seemed to take forever as bullets cracked past her head and explosions shook the ground. Her medical bag felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but she never slowed down. Just as enemy fire began to zero in on her position again, strong, hands grabbed her shoulders and pulled her through a gap in the compound wall. "Welcome to hell, Doc," Williams said with a grim smile as Sarah collapsed against the inside wall, gasping for breath. Around her, she could see the true situation, for the first time. The compound was a mess of rubble and debris from hours of fighting. Wounded soldiers lay in whatever shelter they could find, while their comrades continued to fight from defensive positions. Sarah immediately went to work. Rodriguez was unconscious and barely breathing, his pulse weak and irregular. She quickly established an IV line and began administering medications to stabilize his heart rhythm. Working by flashlight in the chaos of battle, she performed an emergency procedure to relieve pressure on his brain from swelling caused by his head injury. The next soldier, Corporal Jackson, had taken a bullet through his shoulder that had shattered his collarbone and damaged major blood vessels. Sarah worked quickly to stop the bleeding and repair the torn arteries using techniques she had practiced hundreds of times, but never under such extreme conditions. Her hands were steady despite the explosions and gunfire just meters away. As she worked on the third casualty, a young private with severe abdominal wounds, Sarah realized that she was no longer just treating individual soldiers. She had become the lifeline for the entire unit. Every successful treatment gave the other soldiers hope and determination to keep fighting. Her presence had changed the dynamic of the entire battle. "Doc," Williams called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "Enemies massing for another assault. Looks like they're bringing up heavy weapons. If they break through our perimeter, we're all dead." Sarah looked up from the soldier she was treating. Blood covered her hands and uniform, and exhaustion was beginning to set in after hours of intense medical procedures, but she had come too far to give up now. "How many more wounded do we have?" "3 critical, maybe 4 more with serious injuries," Williams replied. "But Doc, if they overrun us, it won't matter how good your medical skills are." Sarah made another decision that would define her legacy. She pulled out her sidearm, checked that it was loaded, and placed it within easy reach. "Then we make sure they don't overrun us," she said simply, returning to work on her patient. "I didn't come this far to watch these soldiers die." The enemy assault began just as Sarah finished stabilizing the private's abdominal injuries. Explosions rocked the compound as enemy fighters charged toward the walls from multiple directions. Sarah continued working on her patients even as bullets flew overhead and chunks of concrete fell around her. She had found her place in this battle, and nothing was going to make her abandon the soldiers who needed her. The enemy assault hit the compound like a hurricane of steel and fire. Rocket-propelled grenades exploded against the walls, sending concrete fragments flying in all directions. Sarah threw herself over Rodriguez to protect him from the debris while continuing to monitor his vital signs. The young soldier was finally stable, but he would die if his treatment was interrupted now. All around the compound, Alpha Company fought desperately to hold their defensive positions. The enemy had brought reinforcements and heavy weapons, turning what had been a difficult situation into a fight for survival. Ammunition was running low. Several defensive positions had been damaged by explosions, and the enemy fighters were getting closer with each assault wave. "Doc, we need you over here," Corporal Martinez shouted from the north wall. Another soldier had been hit during the enemy charge, taking a bullet through his leg that had severed a major artery. Blood was pumping out faster than the field dressing could contain it. Sarah faced an impossible choice. Rodriguez needed constant monitoring to ensure his brain injury didn't deteriorate, but the new casualty would bleed to death in minutes without immediate surgical intervention. She looked around the compound and made a decision that shocked everyone present. "Williams, I need you to monitor Rodriguez's breathing and pulse," she called out while grabbing her surgical kit. "If his breathing becomes irregular or his pulse drops below 60, call me immediately." She was asking a combat soldier with no medical training to help keep a critically injured man alive. "Doc, I don't know anything about that medical stuff," Williams protested, but Sarah was already moving toward the bleeding soldier. "You'll learn fast," Sarah replied, beginning emergency surgery to repair the damaged artery. "Count his breathing. If it's less than 10 breaths per minute or more than 30, yell for me. Feel his pulse on his neck. If you can't find it, or if it's really fast, yell for me. Working under fire, Sarah performed what should have been a 20-minute procedure in less than 10 minutes. Her hands moved with precision even as explosions shook the building and bullets cracked overhead. She had entered a state of complete focus where nothing existed except the patient in front of her and the techniques she had trained for years to master. Meanwhile, Williams watched over Rodriguez with intense concentration, counting breaths and monitoring pulse just as Sarah had instructed. The grizzled sergeant who had dismissed medics as just support was now completely dependent on Sarah's medical expertise and his own ability to follow her instructions. The enemy assault reached its peak intensity just as Sarah finished repairing the damaged artery. Explosions were so frequent that the compound shook constantly, and the defensive fire from Alpha Company was becoming sporadic as ammunition ran low. Several enemy fighters had made it to the compound walls and were trying to climb over or break through weak points. That's when Sarah did something that no one expected. With her latest patient stabilized, she grabbed her rifle and moved to a defensive position alongside the infantry soldiers. "I can shoot too," she said simply when Williams stared at her in amazement. For the next hour, Sarah alternated between treating wounded soldiers and fighting alongside them. When someone was hit, she would drop her rifle and become a medic. When the wounded were stable, she would pick up her weapon and return to the fight. The other soldiers watched in awe as the quiet support person they had underestimated proved herself to be as tough and capable as any of them. The turning point came when enemy fighters managed to breach the south wall. 3 insurgents made it inside the compound before being spotted, creating chaos as they fired into the defensive positions from behind. Sarah was working on another wounded soldier when she saw one of the enemy fighters moving toward Rodriguez, who was still unconscious and helpless. Without hesitation, Sarah drew her sidearm and engaged the enemy fighter at close range. Her training kicked in as she moved to protect her patient while engaging a deadly threat. The brief firefight ended with the enemy fighter neutralized, but not before Sarah had taken a bullet in her shoulder. Ignoring her own wound, Sarah continued treating the soldier she had been working on when the breach occurred. Blood soaked through her uniform from the shoulder injury, but her hands remained steady as she worked to save another life. Williams watched in amazement as Sarah refused to even acknowledge her own injury until her patient was stable. "Doc, you're bleeding pretty bad," Williams said, pointing to the growing dark stain on her uniform. "I've had worse," Sarah replied, though everyone could see the pain in her eyes. "How's Rodriguez doing?" "Breathing steady, pulse strong," Williams reported. He had become surprisingly good at monitoring the injured soldier under Sarah's guidance. Dawn began to break over the Helmand Valley. The enemy assault finally began to weaken. Alpha Company had held their position through the longest night of their lives, but at a terrible cost. More than half the unit was wounded, ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the compound was barely defensible after hours of explosions and gunfire. Sarah had treated 23 wounded soldiers during the battle, performed 8 emergency surgeries under fire, and fought alongside the infantry when needed. Her shoulder wound was serious but not life-threatening, though she would need proper medical attention soon. More importantly, every soldier she had treated was still alive. As helicopter gunships finally arrived to drive off the remaining enemy fighters, Sarah collapsed against a wall, exhaustion finally overwhelming her adrenaline. She had proven that support personnel could be every bit as brave and essential as frontline fighters. But more than that, she had shown that sometimes the most important battles are won not through firepower, but through the determination to never give up on the lives entrusted to your care. The rescue helicopters arrived as the sun cast long shadows across the battle-scarred compound. Sarah watched through exhausted eyes as Apache gunships circled overhead, their weapon systems tracking any remaining enemy movement in the surrounding area. The distinctive sound of incoming Black Hawk helicopters had never sounded so beautiful to the survivors of Alpha Company. The first helicopter to land carried fresh troops and supplies, but Sarah barely noticed them. She was focused on preparing her patients for evacuation, ensuring that each wounded soldier had proper documentation of their injuries and treatments. Her own shoulder wound had stiffened during the night, making every movement painful, but she refused assistance until every other casualty had been properly prepared for transport. Captain Johnson was among the reinforcements, and Sarah watched, his face as he surveyed the destruction of the compound. Bodies of enemy fighters were scattered around the walls, evidence of the fierce battle that had raged through the night. The compound itself looked like it had been hit by an earthquake. Walls were cracked and partially collapsed. Equipment was destroyed, and bloodstains marked the spots where soldiers had fallen. "Martinez," Captain Johnson called out, approaching Sarah as she finished checking Rodriguez's condition one final time. The young soldier was conscious now, though weak, and he managed a small smile when he saw his medic. "I need a full report on casualties and treatments." Sarah pulled a blood-stained notebook from her pocket, where she had meticulously documented every patient throughout the battle. 23 wounded treated, sir. 8 required emergency surgery. 15 had serious wounds requiring immediate evacuation. All patients are stable for transport. Her voice was hoarse from shouting over the noise of battle, but her report was precise and professional. Captain Johnson stared at her in disbelief. "You treated 23 casualties? In one night under fire?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied simply. "Sergeant Williams assisted with patient monitoring. Private Chen helped with supplies when he wasn't needed at his position. Everyone did their part." Williams approached, still covered in dust and blood from the battle. Sarah noticed that he looked at her differently now, not as support personnel but as a fellow warrior who had earned his complete respect. "Sir, you need to know something about Doc Martinez," Williams said. "She didn't just treat our wounded. When the enemy breached the south wall, she took down one of them at close range while protecting Rodriguez. And when we were running low on ammunition, she grabbed a rifle and fought alongside us. The evacuation process took several hours as each wounded soldier was carefully loaded onto helicopters and flown to proper medical facilities. Sarah insisted on accompanying the most critical patients, providing continued care during transport, despite her own need for treatment. It wasn't until the last patient was evacuated that she finally allowed medical personnel to examine her shoulder wound. The field surgeon at Kandahar Airfield was impressed by Sarah's work as he treated her injury. "I've reviewed the medical records from your patients," he said while cleaning her bullet wound. "Your battlefield surgery was textbook perfect. Several of those soldiers would have died without immediate intervention." News of the battle spread quickly through the military community. Alpha Company's successful defense against overwhelming odds became a story that inspired troops throughout the region. But among the soldiers who had been there, the real hero was clear. Sarah Martinez, the quiet medic they had once dismissed as just support, had proven that courage comes in many forms. 3 weeks later, Sarah stood in formation as the battalion commander read the citation for her Silver Star Medal. The award recognized her extraordinary heroism under fire, her life-saving medical care of 23 wounded soldiers, and her direct combat action against enemy forces. She was the first female medic in the battalion to receive such a high honor. After the ceremony, Rodriguez approached her on crutches, his head injury having healed enough for him to return to limited duty. "Doc, I wanted to thank you," he said, struggling with the emotions of someone who knew his life had been saved. "The doctor said I was maybe 10 minutes from dying when you got to me. You didn't just save my life, you risked your own life to save all of us." Sarah looked around at the other soldiers from Alpha Company who had gathered after the ceremony. These were the same men who had once seen her as unnecessary support staff, but their attitudes had completely changed. They now understood that in modern warfare, the distinction between combatants and support personnel was meaningless. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone could be a hero when the situation demanded it. 6 months later, Sarah received orders to return to the United States for advanced medical training. The Army had recognized her exceptional abilities and wanted to develop her skills further. As she packed her belongings for the journey home, she reflected on how much had changed since her deployment began. The quiet girl from Texas who had joined the Army to become a nurse had become something more. She had proven that heroism isn't about seeking glory or recognition. It's about refusing to break when others are depending on you. Sarah Martinez had been seen as just support until the night when 200 soldiers bled and she refused to let them die. That night, she had shown that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons but with skill, courage, and an unwavering commitment to never abandon those who need you most. Her story would be told and retold in military circles for years to come, inspiring a new generation of medics and support personnel to understand that their role was just as vital as any frontline fighter. Sarah had changed not just her own perception of what it meant to serve, but the perception of an entire military community about the value and courage of those who heal rather than harm.